Germany didn't start the First World War, but Germany is the reason it became a world war. On the 28th of June 1914, a Serbian nationalist in Bosnia assassinated the heir apparent to the thrones of Austria and Hungary. Suspecting the Serbian government of involvement in the assassination, Austrian officials demanded permission to investigate in Serbia. When rebuffed, they threatened to invade. Normally, Austria would never have actually followed through on this threat, as it would have triggered a defensive alliance between Serbia and the Russian Empire. But Emperor Wilhelm II of Germany stepped in and promised to back up Austria in any such war, the infamous blank check. However, Germany's invasion of Russia would have triggered yet another defensive alliance between Russia and France. But having seen Russia's failures in their war against Japan a decade earlier, Wilhelm and many German military leaders believed that they could take France out of the war before Russia could even mobilize a credible defense. Of course, their plan to do so involved circumventing French defenses by invading neutral Belgium, which would have triggered Britain into declaring war. But due to a historical aversion to fighting wars in Europe, the British army was really small by European standards, and most of it was in India. So German leadership figured that they wouldn't be able to mobilize quickly enough to prevent Belgium and France from falling. The war would be over by Christmas. When war broke out in early July, most of Germany became enraptured in the spirit of 1914, and despite his personal prejudices, the emperor was no exception. On the 4th of August, he entered the Reichstag in Berlin and declared a policy known as Burgfrieden, an indefinite truce between all political parties, economic interests, and demographic sectors in service of the common war effort. The message was simple. Today, we are all Germans. The German Empire wasn't an absolute monarchy like Russia, nor was it a fully constitutional monarchy like Britain. On the one hand, the Reichstag was a legislature elected by the German people. It had political parties, passed laws, and its confidence was essential to the executive branch of government. But the emperor was still responsible for appointing the chancellor and his ministers, who were almost always nonpartisan, and thus he retained a huge influence on policy. This is why he was able to give Austria the blank check, and it's why he was able to declare Burgfrieden. Support for the war spanned almost the entire political spectrum. In most of Europe, socialist groups at least tended to be against the war, or at least narrowly divided amongst themselves. This wasn't the case with the German Social Democratic Party, who had recently become the largest party in the Reichstag and overwhelmingly supported the war. 2 weeks in, Social Democratic Deputy Ludwig Frank announced his own intention to enlist in the army. Just 3 weeks later, he became the first member of the Reichstag to be killed in action. It's worth mentioning that Frank was also Jewish. Burgfrieden wasn't just a truce between political parties, it represented a pause on virtually all social divisions in Germany. Much like in France prior to the Dreyfus Affair, Jews weren't unknown to the German military, but outside of wartime there had been certain unofficial policies limiting their participation. As a general rule, military academies didn't admit Jews, and officer commissions were almost entirely contingent on conversion to Christianity. In the rare case that Jews were allowed to become officers without converting, they served almost exclusively in the artillery and engineer corps, positions which usually required a civilian education and which were seen as less noble than traditional frontline roles. Suddenly, that was over. On the 29th of September 1914, Prussian Deputy Minister of War Franz Gustav von Wandel issued a special order sweeping all of those restrictions away. But at the same time, Burgfrieden went against decades of German cultural nationalism, in particular the anti-Semitic movement. On the one hand, German Jews had always played a major role in German nationalism and the ultimate unification of the empire. Figures like Gabriel Riese had participated in early attempts at unification in the mid-19th century. German unification had resulted in a net expansion of Jewish political rights, offering citizenship to Jews in some small states where they had never been emancipated. And Germany's first chancellor, Otto von Bismarck, had been adamant in opening the door to Jewish participation in the new Germany. But unlike in Italy, where Jewish emancipation was directly tied to nationalism via opposition to the papacy, or in Romania, where anti-Semitism was a driving force in the nationalist cause, the twin causes of Jewish rights and German nationhood were never intrinsically linked. Philo-Semitic and anti-Semitic elements had always coexisted within it. And following German unification in 1871, they began to grow and evolve in new ways. As far back as the Napoleonic Wars, Jews in Germany had been trending towards a more politically liberal and aesthetically westernized way of life, Germany being the birthplace of modern Orthodox, conservative, classical, and radical Reform Judaism. Following unification, this tendency towards liberalism and cultural integration had manifested in national politics, with the vast majority of German Jews supporting either the Social Democrats or the center-left Progressive People's Party. Meanwhile, the anti-Semitic wing of German politics had only become more extreme. The term anti-Semitism itself was coined in 1881 by journalist Wilhelm Marr in order to distinguish his racially based hatred of Jews from the more traditional and religious concept of Judenhass. Historian and politician Heinrich von Treitschke promoted the idea that Germans were the inheritors of a pure Indo-European or Aryan heritage that had been corrupted by inferior races, most especially Jews, and that Germans had both a destiny and an obligation to overpower and destroy those races. And despite Marr's intention to distance his anti-Semitism from religion, by the outbreak of the First World War, German anti-Semitism had itself become a religion. Beginning in the 1890s, a collection of German nationalists in Austria developed a neo-pagan movement called Ariosophy, which combined German Romanticism with superficial elements of Hinduism, Norse mythology, and theosophy, an internationally popular occult movement which already had some associations with pseudo-scientific racism. Ignatius Donnelly and the People's Party over in the US had been theosophists. Very quickly, Ariosophical ideas were embraced by German anti-Semites as an alternative to Christianity, which they saw as yet another corrupting Jewish influence. In 1912, German occultist Theodor Fritsch established two organizations, the clan-like secret society Germanenorden and the public-facing lobby group Reichshammerbund, dedicated to promoting esoteric anti-Semitism on a national scale. Concurrently, a number of small political parties had emerged, placing anti-Semitism at the center of their platforms, most of which had merged into the far-right German National Party by the start of the war. Under the declared policy of Burgfrieden, military censors held much of these groups' propaganda from publication. But Burgfrieden also protected them from criticism. And as the unifying spirit of 1914 faded, each of these groups would play a key role in the demonization of German Jews. I don't know who needs to hear this, but the war was not over by Christmas. The invasion of Belgium had taken much longer than expected, giving the French army much-needed time to set up a northern defense. The British and the Russians had mobilized way faster than expected. Germany's allies, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, had completely lost the initiative and were now struggling to defend their own borders. The war had become an unfathomably bloody stalemate, with no end in sight. Additionally, the United Front of 1914 had been imperfect from the very start. Remember when I said that the Social Democrats had overwhelmingly supported the war? Well, the initial decision to go to war hadn't been so smooth. SPD leader Hugo Haase had vocally opposed the blank check, and while he initially fell in line when war was declared, his disapproval rebounded as the conflict dragged on until he was forced out of the party leadership. That Haase was Jewish almost certainly provided a grain of legitimacy to the aims of the anti-Semitic movement. The same could be said for the situation in Alsace-Lorraine, a mostly German-speaking area that had historically belonged to France but was annexed by Germany in 1871. You may recall that, in the 1890s, French artillery captain Alfred Dreyfus had been framed as a German spy on the basis that he was a Jew from the lost territory of Alsace. This is ironic because German rule in Alsace was extremely unpopular. Despite having their land annexed on the basis of being fellow Germans, Alsace was essentially treated as an occupied territory, with locals facing constant abuse from German soldiers and electing pro-French protest parties to the Reichstag. When the war broke out, a sizable number of fighting-age Alsatian men defected to the French side in the hopes of liberating their native land. Alsace also had a disproportionately large Jewish population who were also largely favorable to France, and many of whom ended up fighting for France, even including Reichstag deputy Georges Weil. But peace activists, French patriots, these were principled, even brave positions, and that just didn't fit the narrative. In all its forms, the German anti-Semitic movement had preconceived an image of Jews as innately bourgeois, cowardly, and duplicitous. One minor party, the Agrarian League, even argued that Jews were genetically incapable of farming due to their arid origins. In the context of the war, these stereotypes coalesced into that of the Drückeberger, the shirker, or in the American parlance, chicken hawk, someone who exploited the war for the advancement of ideology and profit, but was unwilling to put himself in harm's way and do the hard work of fighting. In March 1916, Theodor Fritsch and Reichshammerbund President Alfred Roth launched a letter-writing campaign to the Reichstag, local governments, and the military, accusing German Jews of systematically avoiding military service and engaging in large-scale profiteering. Neither Chief of Staff Erich von Falkenhayn nor Deputy Minister Wandel would have anything to do with such accusations, but that wouldn't be a problem for long. If it wasn't already clear, the policy of Burgfrieden didn't make partisan politics go away. It had merely pushed it underground. The outbreak of war in 1914 had come at a high point for the German left, and as the war continued, the SPD and FVP had begun working with Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg to abolish the class-based voting system in Prussia and make local elections more democratic. The conservative, aristocratic Protestant establishment that had once dominated German politics now faced the prospect of total irrelevance. And as a result, the German Conservative Party began tacitly endorsing the anti-Semitic movement in order to discredit Bethmann-Hollweg as a Jewish puppet and eventually remove him from office. We're not going to talk about that right now because it took an entire year to carry out, but the anti-Semites' real breakthrough came in the summer of 1916. In early June, Russia launched the Brusilov offensive, invading Galicia and convincing Romania to enter the war on the side of the Allies, which threatened to split the Central Powers in two. The following month, Britain and France launched the Battle of the Somme, taking previously unimaginable casualties to push the Germans back. And that's just on the battlefield. Back home, the German war machine really seemed to be reaching its limits. Whereas the Allies had huge empires to fall back on, Germany was pretty much on its own. Yes, they had the other Central Powers, but in terms of military strength and industry, they were way more reliant on Germany than Germany was on them. The army were already struggling to find more soldiers to conscript, but every new conscript was also one less worker to produce weapons and ammo, or one less farmer to feed the army. So in addition to retreating on both fronts, Germany was now having to deal with labor strikes and food riots. Nobody was winning the war, but for the first time, it was starting to feel like Germany was losing. If ever there was a time for the anti-Semitic movement to use Jews as a scapegoat, this was it. Now, this wasn't public knowledge yet, but around this time, the 2nd Army Corps headquarters in Stettin began receiving a wave of angry letters claiming that Jews as a collective were either avoiding military service by getting bogus deferments or seeking out cushy administrative positions instead of fighting on the front lines. Now, this was almost certainly an early example of brigading by the Reichshammerbund, but there were plenty of people at 2nd Army Corps who were sympathetic to the anti-Semites, so it didn't just go away. Instead, Colonel Ernst von Wrießberg, basically the person in charge of recruiting, passed these allegations on to the various state ministers of war and ultimately to the anti-Semitic factions in the Reichstag. On the 17th of June, DVP leader Ferdinand Werner called for a general audit of Jews in the military and in wartime industry in order to expose what he believed to be a vast conspiracy against the national war effort. Finally, on the 29th of August, Falkenhayn was dismissed as Chief of Staff, with Wandel resigning in frustration the following month. In Falkenhayn's place came Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, who brought in his second-in-command General Erich Ludendorff to serve as first quartermaster general. Hindenburg and Ludendorff had overseen Germany's only major victory in the war, invading Poland and pushing the Russians back to their pre-1797 borders, and thus they were brought in to fix the deadlock in the West and the logistical issues on the home front. Everything was on the table, resuming the illegal policy of unrestricted submarine warfare, creating a puppet kingdom in Poland in order to raise a new Polish army against Russia, sponsoring anti-colonial uprisings in Africa and Asia, and an end to Burgfrieden. But most importantly for our purposes, Hindenburg and Ludendorff were closely tied to the anti-Semitic movement and had always been more open to the possibility that widespread Jewish shirking was undermining the war effort. To our knowledge, there's no surviving documentation indicating the decision process behind the creation of the Jewish census, or Judenzählung. But without Wandel to manage the War Office in Berlin, Prussia's new Minister of War, Adolf Wildt von Hohenborn, was uninterested in refuting claims of Jewish shirking. At the same time, Jewish organizations in Germany had established the Committee of War Statistics, dedicated to documenting the military service of Jews as a show of patriotism. Pictures like this, of Jewish officers observing Yom Kippur in an occupied French church, were shown far and wide as a point of pride in Jewish German spaces. Hohenborn, however, feared that such records would be used after the war to lobby against the resumption of military discrimination. And on top of all that, potato blight and unusually cold weather was plunging Germany into famine, putting a real dent into public support for the war for the first time. So on the 11th of October, Hohenborn finally sent out a memorandum.
The War Ministry is continually receiving complaints from the population that large numbers of men of the Israelitic faith who are fit for military service are either exempt from military duties or are evading their obligation to serve under every conceivable pretext. According to these reports, large numbers of Jews in military service are also said to have obtained assignments in administrative or clerical posts far away from the front lines, either with the rear echelon or in the homeland. In order to refute these complaints and, should they prove unwarranted, to be able to refute them, the War Ministry respectfully requests that the pertinent information be supplied in accordance with the two attached forms and returned to the War Ministry by the 1st of December 1916.
Despite Hohenborn's statement that the survey was intended to refute the accusations, neither he nor anyone else calling for the Judendzählung wanted any such thing. But if the 1912 election results were anything to go by, the anti-Semitic movement was still very fringe and needed some degree of plausible deniability. If the Judendzählung could prove that Jews were disproportionately avoiding service, or that they were serving disproportionately in non-combat roles, then the anti-Semites would be satisfied, Jewish activists would be silenced, and the supposed controversy could go mainstream, which could be politically useful after the war. This hadn't gone unnoticed by Jews serving in administration. Physicist Walter Rathenau, who had resigned from the Prussian War Ministry due to systemic anti-Semitism, had already written that such an effort would only be used to demonize Jews in the public mind. Even if the evidence disproved their point, they would find a way to twist it in their favor. The survey was to be conducted over a 30-day period. It asked how many Jewish personnel each unit had, how many had received the Iron Cross, and how many had been proactively enlisted rather than being conscripted. Personnel were also divided into three groups: frontline soldiers, non-frontline soldiers, and occupation forces, which meant people who were behind the front lines but not in Germany itself. There was one Jewish Reichstag member, Ludwig Haas, who was serving by overseeing schools for Jewish children in the new Kingdom of Poland, so he was in the occupation forces, though he had started out on the front line in Flanders, which goes to show how this survey didn't really work. Only after the survey began was its existence revealed to the Reichstag, and while hardcore anti-Semitism was hardly mainstream, it was surprisingly difficult for Jewish groups and their allies to voice their opposition. The conservatives had given their unspoken support to the Judendzählung, and the moderate parties simply tried to avoid acknowledging the prejudice behind it. The Social Democrats and progressives were missing a sizable chunk of their members who'd gone off to fight in the war. And anyway, the policy of Burgfrieden forbade them from being too critical of military policy. The best they could do was subpoena Vriesberg to testify on the controversy and thus bring it to public attention on their terms. Instead, the job of challenging the survey fell to two parties: the Alliance of German Jews, a civil rights lobbying group led by Prussian state legislator Oskar Kassel, and Max Warburg, a Hamburg-based investment banker and probably the richest Jew in the empire. The day after the Judendzählung was leaked, Kassel began regular trips to the War Department to voice his concerns. Nearly as soon as the survey began, the Alliance of German Jews had begun to receive telegrams from Jewish soldiers complaining that their commanders had removed them from their units in order to keep the number of Jewish combat troops artificially low. Luckily for Kassel, Hohenborn had been removed as Prussian Minister of War even before the survey began, and his replacement, General Hermann von Stein, was far less sympathetic to the anti-Semites. On the 11th of November, Stein sent out an addendum to the survey stating that it was not intended to discourage commanders from having Jewish troops, so stop transferring them. Kassel was happy with this and, astonishingly, dropped the issue for the next several weeks. Even if commanders weren't actively hiding Jewish soldiers, the Judendzählung still failed to account for those who were wounded in hospital or on leave, It asked unit commanders to record the number of Jews killed in action, but not those who'd been captured or permanently disabled. Just as Rathenau had predicted, absence of evidence was being used as evidence of absence. But if Kassel was approaching this with the feathered touch of an elderly politician, Max Warburg was using a sledgehammer. Max's brother Paul Warburg had previously worked at the investment bank Kuhn Loeb under the famous Jacob Schiff, who years earlier had led a boycott of Russian government bonds due to Russia's treatment of Jews. This worked because public opinion in the US had been overwhelmingly sympathetic to Russian Jews, and Warburg had warned Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg even before the Judenseelung that continued discrimination in Germany could provoke a similar boycott. Now he asked the Chancellor for a simple public statement disavowing the Judenseelung. Warburg had a lot of pull with Bethmann Hollweg. He likely played a major role in convincing the government to cease unrestricted submarine warfare for fear that it would provoke the US into joining the Allies. And Bethmann Hollweg fully agreed with Warburg that the Judenseelung was a national embarrassment, but he was still too spooked by the anti-Semites' campaign against him to take public action. In December, with the survey concluded, complaints continued to pour into the Alliance of German Jews from soldiers claiming further harassment and failing morale. Contrary to the addendum of November 11th, some COs had continued transferring Jewish soldiers away from the front in order to suppress their numbers. Once again, high-ranking officers were refusing commissions to qualify Jewish soldiers. No less than the state government of Baden had joined with Kassel and Warburg in demanding a formal repudiation of the Judenseelung. But again, nothing happened. In January, both Oskar Kassel and Max Warburg resumed lobbying the Prussian War Ministry for a public statement disavowing the intentions of the Judenseelung. At the time, the German central bank was preparing to issue a new round of war bonds, leading Warburg to warn that opposition to Judenseelung could lead to a Jewish boycott. I'm not convinced that the majority of German Jews would have gone that far, but Warburg was absolutely prepared to, and bankers in Frankfurt were even leading protest marches against the Judenseelung. But the Prussian War Ministry wouldn't budge. On the 12th of January, Minister Hermann von Stein confided to Kassel that while he also disapproved of the Judenseelung, he felt that a public statement reiterating the contributions of Jewish soldiers would be an abuse of his power, as it would unfairly single out the Jewish community for recognition. Kassel, in turn, argued that the Jews had already been singled out for condemnation by the very act of conducting the survey. In their official correspondence, Stein continued to defend the honor of his predecessor Hohenborn, but this was likely just a matter of propriety and self-preservation, as on the 20th of January he wrote to Kassel that, while he couldn't outright admit that the survey had been anti-Semitic in intent, he could admit that it had been conducted without merit, and that Kassel was free to make his feelings public. Apparently, Kassel was satisfied with that outcome, but Warburg wasn't, and justifiably so. Though Stein's disavowal of the Judenseelung was publicized by Jewish civil rights groups, it wasn't the formal repudiation that they'd hoped for, and it garnered virtually no mainstream attention. From Warburg's perspective, Kassel's only real accomplishment had been to silence Jewish opposition to the Judenseelung while giving the anti-Semitic movement a free pass in the public eye, a perception that Kassel did nothing to dispel. Warburg's concerns were swiftly validated. Over the previous month, Bethmann Hollweg had been compelled to reject a peace proposal from the US and resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, a move which ultimately provoked the US into declaring war. In July, Bethmann Hollweg's electoral reform initiative failed for the last time and he resigned as chancellor. In his absence, Germany effectively became a military dictatorship under Hindenburg and Ludendorff. So you're probably wondering, what were the results of the Judenseelung? The honest answer is that we don't know and probably never will. The results of the survey were never published, and it's widely believed that the survey forms themselves were destroyed in the Allied bombing of Potsdam during the Second World War. Some historians suspect that, due to the fraught circumstances under which it was conducted, no summary of the survey was ever even written. However, in 1919, a year after the war's end, Reichshammerbund leader Alfred Roth, writing under the pseudonym Otto Armin, published The Jew in the Army, an analysis of what he claimed to be the actual results of the Judenseelung. According to him, the survey counted a total of 62,515 Jewish soldiers and officers, of whom 44% were serving on the front lines, 8% on the home front, and 48% as occupation troops in places like Poland and Belgium. Of these 62,515, he claims that 6,000 had been killed in action. In total, these troops would comprise slightly under 10% of the Jewish population of the empire, compared to 18% of the general population who served in the war. He also claims that an additional 12,051 Jewish conscripts had been disqualified as unfit, and that 7,065 had received some other kind of deferment. Now, we've already discussed the problems with the Judendzählung itself, but Roth's analysis is a whole new level of garbage. Even assuming that he was actually working off the real data, this would be a textbook example of how to misuse it. Firstly, he outright dismissed allegations of data manipulation on the grounds that only Jewish soldiers had complained, and that Jews are simply inherently dishonest. Of course, only Jewish soldiers would have been subject to the survey, so only they would have been in a position to complain. Also, you can't cite your own thesis in support of itself. Secondly, Roth merely asserted that 62,515 was a small number without any real context. His claim that only 10% of the Jewish population was enlisted in the army at the time of the survey also ignores the fact that nearly 11% of Germany's Jewish population were non-citizen immigrants, and thus would have been ineligible for service. Yes, he said that 18% of the empire's population had served in the war, and he is roughly correct, but he doesn't provide any raw numbers for overall personnel. And even that would have been an apples to oranges comparison, because the Judendzählung was only intended as a snapshot of Jewish servicemen in the army in November 1916. To use this data in the way he did was to assume that no Jews joined the army for the rest of the war, that no Jews had been discharged prior to the survey, that no Jews had served in the Navy, since it wasn't part of the survey, that frontline and occupation troops never switched roles, which happened all the time, and that there was no reason for such a large percentage of troops to serve an occupation role in an occupying army. Roth knew all of this. He was the president of the Reichshammerbund. The Judendzählung had at least partly been his idea. In spite of that, Roth not only denied that Jews were subject to discrimination in the army, but that the army had unfairly privileged Jews at the expense of real Germans. This, he argued, was the prime mechanism by which Germany ultimately lost the war. The Jews had stabbed the empire in the back. Roth obviously didn't care about backing up his points, even with the skewed data that he had, but then neither did most people. Having lost the war, the general public in Germany were not interested in relitigating these kinds of issues. But that isn't to say that Roth's claims went unchallenged. In 1922, sociologist Franz Oppenheimer and statistician Jakob Segal each released reports on Jewish service based on data collected over the course of the war by the Committee of War Statistics. Thus far, they had documented 84,352 Jewish servicemen across all branches of the military. At the time of publication, they had yet to compile data from Alsace-Lorraine, Posen, and Hamburg. But assuming a similar rate of recruitment in those areas as in the rest of the empire, Segal and Oppenheimer estimated that 96,327 Jews had served in the war, 15.7% of the empire's Jewish population, and 17.5% of Jewish German citizens. This was less than the 18.7% of German citizens who had served overall, but still close enough to refute allegations of excess deferments, and it was in line with estimates made by the committee during the war. Of those who had served, approximately 78% had served in a combat role at some point. Additionally, 35% of Jewish servicemen had received decorations for merit, with half receiving the Iron Cross, and 23% had received field promotions. 2.4% had served as officers, and 1.4% as medics. 12% were killed in action. But it gets worse. Because over 3/4 of Jewish servicemen had enlisted or were drafted prior to the Judendzählung, and over a third had done so in just the first 5 months of the war, if not before the war, the German military of 1914 had likely been disproportionately Jewish. If there'd been a shortfall in Jewish representation by the war's end, it was only a consequence of the Judendzählung. Segal and Oppenheimer ended their studies with a recommendation that the government of the new German Republic conduct an independent review of their research and, if corroborated, enter it into the public record as a corrective to the Judendzählung. And they did. In 1961. In the meantime, Riesberg jumped to Roth's defense, publishing his own copy of Roth's numbers in 1923, and the cycle began again. Now, neither Oppenheimer nor Zegel pointed this out, but there were some sectors of the army in which Jewish men particularly excelled, and I need people to know about it. In addition to the aforementioned artillery and engineering corps, there was another highly technical, relatively new specialized contingent in which Jews were overrepresented. We all remember the Red Baron, but Germany had many famous Jewish ace pilots, whose contributions were intentionally omitted from official histories in the interwar period by the likes of Hindenburg and Ludendorff. I mean, come on, has anyone looked more like a fighter pilot than this guy? Such was the enthusiasm by which German Jews reported for duty that the Army and Navy required at least 30 field rabbis, of which 4 were awarded a unique version of the Iron Cross. And if that doesn't say it all, I don't know what will. Special thanks to my patrons, including Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Matthew Feinberg, Jay Fleischman, Oshar Gordon, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Sol Cohn, Jacob Kossoff, Eric Liederman, Jeffrey Schweitzer, and Ian York.